The negotiations on the deal were completed last week. Will be unprecedented, historic. I think it will be a huge feather in the cap. There will be concessions that have been agreed on both sides. I think it's almost impossible to assess the thinking of the president. I don't think that the United States and India have ever gone so far in trade negotiations. It will still be partial. It won't be a comprehensive deal. It's not a free trade agreement. I think the ambition is very close to an FTA, free trade agreement. I think that there are circumstances in which both sides can claim victory with an agreement that we anticipate. The bigger threat, and one that concerns India and concerns many other countries, Japan as well, is the so-called 232s.
So the India-US trade negotiations are going down to the wire. India thinks the ball is now in America's court as these two countries try to conclude a trade agreement that hopefully puts them on the path to what they said that they would do. That is building a $500 billion trade relationship, of course, with President Trump and Prime Minister Modi talking about this issue. India's negotiating team was in America earlier this month, has now headed back. And of course, now there's a lot of anticipation about whether the two sides can actually reach this trade agreement and also what the consequences will be if they don't. And now sitting down with me to unpack this very issue is Mark Linscott, who was from 2016 to 2018 the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for South and Central Asian Affairs. He's handled India specifically for several years. Perhaps no one in Washington more experienced with India-U.S. trade matters. Mr. Linscott, thank you so much for joining us. Could you just begin by explaining to our audience where we are exactly in this India-U.S. trade negotiation? People have seen a lot of headlines. They've heard a lot about it. What exactly is the state of play right now as India and the United States try to get this free trade agreement done?
Sure. Well, this is my take. It's educated guessing to some extent. I think we are all engaging in a bit of a guessing game, but I actually think the deal was completed. The negotiations on the deal were completed last week when the secretary from the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Rajesh Agarwal, was here leading an Indian team, working with his counterpart, my former colleague and deputy, Brendan Lynch, at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. I think they basically sewed up what is likely to be an agreement in principle, not a legally binding agreement, but an agreement in principle in which the two sides issue a statement highlighting what has been agreed so far. I think then there will be continuing negotiations on the specifics for a legally binding agreement, and that's likely to be in the next few weeks. So this is all a great scenario. I'm very hopeful. I'm very happy that we do appear to have a prospect for a deal. It will be unprecedented, historic. I think it will be a huge feather in the cap for both President Trump and Prime Minister Modi to do this. And we've got a bigger negotiation to come. This isn't the end of negotiations. It's just the start, right? And seemingly a successful start to the negotiation.
Right. So we've had this conversation about an early harvest agreement between India and the United States. And then, of course, once this is done, what we're all waiting for, we'll probably see a wider agreement later in the year. So this agreement that we're talking about right now that we're all waiting for, perhaps as early as today, we could see something. Could you tell us a little bit about how ambitious you think that agreement is going to be? Lots of conversation. What is India going to give the United States? What is the United States going to give India? Could you give us a sense of what the ambition is?
Sure. And again, this is to some extent surmising, based on what we've heard and read and conversations we have. I think it will be substantial. I think it will go further than the other two agreements that have been announced so far. And I'm setting aside China because that's in a whole different category. But I think it will be more ambitious than the US-UK deal. I think it will be more ambitious than the Vietnam deal, although we've not seen a text yet on Vietnam. I think it will go quite far. And in contrast to, to the negotiations, I think, with many other countries between the United States, the Trump administration, and many other countries, I think there will be benefits for both sides. There will be concessions that have been agreed on both sides. I think it will be substantial on tariffs.
Mhm.
It won't cover the full tariff schedules for each country, but I think it will be substantial in terms of what we call market access. I think it will include a number of priority non-tariff barriers. I think it will at least start to put together the pieces of some complicated areas like digital trade. And again, I think it's likely to offer benefits to both sides.
Right. Could I also ask you, you've dealt with India-US trade negotiations in the past. You, of course, have also talked about the fact that we could have seen an agreement in the first Trump administration, but for whatever reason, things did not work out. What exactly is the story there? What happened in that first Trump administration that we couldn't see that deal?
Yeah, and you referred earlier to my experience negotiating with India, and it goes back before I did bilateral work. Most of my career was in the WTO in Geneva, the World Trade Organization, and I had been the assistant USTR for WTO and multilateral affairs. And our experience, and I think India's experience in negotiating with us, it was never good. I mean, we rarely shared perspectives. We were rarely able to compromise and reach agreements. And later, I found that working bilaterally with India outside the WTO was more productive, that there was better traction in those negotiations. I think it was a huge missed opportunity in the first Trump administration. I was the first negotiator on that. Those negotiations continued after I retired from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, but it was clear that a deal was in hand. In fact, in many respects, it was the agreement that got away. I think was very unfortunate, and I think to a large extent, it related to President Trump's perspectives on the time about whether it was a big enough deal. Hopefully, this time, what has been negotiated is big enough for him. I mean, that is the one wild card in these remaining hours, and perhaps a day or two, on whether the president has viewed it as big enough to make an announcement that there is a deal. But I'm really bullish. I think it's going to happen. So, the two teams definitely gained experience in that first Trump administration on negotiating bilaterally. We had never really done that before. I think we have experienced negotiating teams on both sides now. Minister Goyal certainly has been in place and has the experience that allow the two sides to reach an agreement. He had a relationship with Bob Lighthizer in the first Trump administration. He's got, I think, a strong relationship with Jameson Greer, the current USTR, and Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce. So I think that experience gained in the first administration is important in terms of them being able to reach the necessary compromises for what we hope to be an announcement of a deal in the next day or so.
Right. I was very interested to hear you say, that the first time it was Donald Trump and whether he thought the deal was big enough. But again, we seem to be in that similar situation because some of the reporting that's come out in just the last couple of days seems to suggest exactly that sticking point, which is that, in your take as well, the deal has been agreed to. From some of the reporting we've seen in the Indian media, the USTR Jameson Greer has also apparently signed off on the deal. It's really sitting, waiting for the nod of President Trump. What exactly is his concern when you say, is the deal big enough? What exactly is Trump looking for?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to assess the thinking of the president. He clearly engages in complicated calculus of what is beneficial for the United States, what's beneficial for the administration, what's beneficial for him in terms of winning in a negotiation. So, it would be almost impossible for me to assess his analysis. What I can provide is my own assessment that what we've heard, what we are anticipating is in fact quite substantial and again unprecedented. I don't think that the United States and India have ever gone so far in trade negotiations. And for example, I think what they might agree to could exceed what India recently agreed to with the United Kingdom in a free trade agreement. So, that just is I think a measure of the breadth of a potential agreement. And from my perspective, it's substantial and it's substantial for both sides.
Understood. Could I ask you a little bit about, just some of the specific terms of the agreement that we might be seeing? Some of the reporting in India has been very focused on the agricultural sector, on the dairy sector, some of the sensitivities in India regarding, America pushing for that access. Of course, there's also a political aspect and dimension to this, not just that, agriculture is a sensitive sector in India, but also the fact that we are in a sensitive place right now in the India-US relationship. Bilateral trust is not extremely high, especially after what we saw in with Operation Sindoor and the tensions that occurred when President Trump claimed credit for a ceasefire. There is a sensitive moment for the prime minister here politically in India. And if he's seen to give ground to President Trump in a trade negotiation after what we've already seen on Operation Sindoor and the tensions with Pakistan, that might not be very politically beneficial for the prime minister. Do you see that as a potential point of sensitivity, some trouble that giving way to America on a trade negotiation will be politically damaging for the prime minister? Will that cause India to dig its heels in? What do you think?
Yeah, first of all, I think this is, despite my assessment that it will be substantial, it will be unprecedented, it will still be partial. It won't be a comprehensive deal. It's not a free trade agreement. I think the ambition is very close to an FTA, free trade agreement, but that's down the road. This is the first bite at the apple. There will be future bites at the apple for both sides. I don't expect dairy to be included. There's a lot of press on wheat. I don't expect wheat to be included. I think they will be negotiated down the road. I think, in fact, there is a high degree of appreciation on the U.S. side for some of the sensitivities associated with dairy in India. So, I think there's been accommodations on both sides in terms of those sensitive areas. And agriculture is sensitive for both sides. It's not, and all countries. I mean, agriculture is always a sensitive sector in trade. With respect to the larger strategic interests and context, it was clearly unfortunate that President Trump made comments linking, the situation with the terrorist attack and Pakistan to the trade negotiations. It's pretty clear that they were not linked up. And hopefully, in announcing an agreement, there's not new confusion created over that issue and new challenges for the prime minister in terms of managing the fallout associated with that. I certainly hope that can be avoided. But again, the president says what he wants. He decides what he wants. I think this agreement, I think that there are circumstances in which both sides can claim victory with an agreement that we anticipate.
Mr. Linscott, could I also ask you, some conversation right now going on about whether we can trust President Trump to stick to a tariff agreement that has been signed, because we just saw the BRICS agreement happen, a BRICS meeting happen in Brazil just a couple of days ago. And then we saw President Trump come out and say that, those countries that align themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS will be hit by a 10% tariff. And of course, India is a founding member of BRICS. And so the question for us is, look, we're negotiating a trade agreement right now, and you're also threatening us with a 10% tariff while we're talking about a trade agreement. What's to say that we sign the agreement and then some some days down the line. We've also seen, for example, a bill in the Senate sponsored by Senator Lindsey Graham saying that those countries buying Russian oil will be hit by a 500% tariff, which again also implicates India. So the question for a lot of people is that, look, we can sign the deal, but can we trust the Trump administration to stick to the terms of the deal and not slam additional tariffs on India? Your view?
Yeah, it's a legitimate concern. We have the benefit of experience with the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, now this Trump administration, and we have examples, particularly with USMCA, U.S. Mexico Canada agreement. At least initially, there were tariffs applied that were not consistent with the free trade agreement, the updated free trade agreement that was done during the first Trump administration. Perhaps even a more telling example is Japan. And my longtime colleague and friend and mentor, Wendy Cutler, has talked about this a lot. There was a Trump administration agreement with Japan, the U.S. Japan trade agreement. The tariffs that have been applied in this second Trump administration clearly are not consistent with that agreement that was done during the first Trump administration. So, it's a legitimate concern for any country negotiating with the Trump administration. With respect to the comments on the BRICS meeting and the potential for a 10% tariff there, I frankly, I've got to do a deep dive on that. I haven't looked at it closely. My initial assessment is that it's more rhetorical than a real threat. I think the bigger threat, and one that concerns India and concerns many other countries, Japan as well, is the so-called 232s, the Section 232 investigations that are pending and the tariffs that already apply. There are already tariffs on steel and aluminum that were recently increased to 50%. There's the tariffs on autos and auto parts at 25%, and then pending investigations which could lead to tariffs on pharmaceuticals, on semiconductors and downstream products, on lumber, on copper, on small trucks. The list goes on. And it's not clear that the Trump administration in these deals is making commitments on those 232 tariffs. I think that's the bigger concern for basically any country, including India, that's currently negotiating with the United States.
Mr. Linscott, just I have two final questions for you. One, of course, is something that we've seen with regards to the broader trade relationship. We've seen this idea of India and the United States hitting $500 billion in trade. That's the understanding that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump reached when Prime Minister Modi went to Washington. But of course, one of the things that India wants to export to America to boost that trade is electronics. And one of the things that we've seen is that Apple, one of America's most famous electronics manufacturers, wants to expand its supply chain in India, but it's facing pressure from President Trump, who is saying that, no, I want you to manufacture in America. And if you manufacture in India, you're going to be hit again with a tariff. So how do those two things square, that we want an ambitious trade agreement, but at the same time, things that will actually boost trade, like electronics, are something that President Trump is less happy with?
Yeah, it's almost too early to tell, I think, in terms of what are the implications in specific sectors. India has obvious export interests in the United States. Pharmaceuticals are an immediate interest. There's roughly, I think, $8 billion in exports from India a year, and hopefully those are not at threat. In fact, I think it could create some difficult political cross currents if tariffs were applied to Indian exports of pharmaceuticals, because it would mean that that medications for many Americans, the prices would go up. Hopefully that is a scenario that's avoided. The specific example you highlight, Apple and consumer electronics, I think India's prospects are very good globally for increasing its exports of consumer electronics and specifically mobile phones. It's already had success, remarkable success in a short period of time. And it just seems unlikely that the the policies of make in the United States, which we are essentially seeing, will ultimately expand to every single product in every single sector, particularly in consumer electronics. It just doesn't seem likely that there can be migration of that production into the United States in ways that would allow your average consumer to actually buy these products. So, it's clear that this is an administration that, like the first Trump administration and like the Biden administration, is trying to bring more manufacturing back to the United States. But I don't think it's realistic that it would extend to a lot of products of export interest to India. But it's a two-way street too. India has had many restrictions in place, including increasing tariffs in the electronics sector going back to 2014 or 2015. It has had non-tariff barriers in place with respect to electronics. And hopefully the negotiations that have been ongoing, the deal that we see, will open up some of that trade for exports from the United States, in the telecom sector, et cetera, because it should be a two-way street in terms of the export interests of both sides.
Right. Mr. Linscott, my final question to you then, and I hate to leave you on a downer, but it is definitely a possibility because, again, some of the reporting we've seen in India is saying that, look, Indian diplomats are saying that the ball is now in Trump's court. There is a possibility that he looks at this deal and says, as he did in his first term, this is not good enough, right? And then in 2 or 3 days' time, those reciprocal tariffs kick in. Is that a realistic possibility?
It's a possibility. I hope it's not I hope it's not the case. I think it would be a mistake. I think what seems to have been negotiated already is clearly in U.S. interests. And I can't say definitively that it won't happen, but I certainly hope that it doesn't happen.
Understood. Mr. Linscott, thank you so much for your time, for joining us here at Hindustan Times, talking to us a little bit about the India-US Free Trade Agreement and also your experience of negotiating these agreements in the past. Again, you're saying that you think it's a good deal. It's a deal that delivers ambitiously for both India and America, a win-win deal, and something that we hope President Trump will approve. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Shashank. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.